Good afternoon. It's nice to see the faithful group here. In the previous two lectures, I sketched in a very rapid fashion what seemed to me to be the necessary locations of managers in the economy of Roman and Byzantine Egypt, and then how these people could be prepared for their roles, although we have no easy way of telling how many managers actually had a suitable education. I turn now to look in more detail at who these managers were and how we can recognize them in the documents. I shall focus first on the terminology used to describe them, ask what terms may be properly thought of as referring to managers, and try to sketch, as far as we can, the hierarchy within managerial structures. This account will necessarily be selective, and some case studies will wait until the final lecture next week. We'll begin with an example that is late, but at a high level, showing us what a managerial hierarchy could look like. This is the administration of imperial estates in Byzantine Egypt, for which we have a recent analysis by Giuseppina Azzarello. She describes a 4 or 5 part structure with some slight uncertainties. First, the epitropos, the highest level administrator. This level is not as well documented in our texts, but would have had responsibility for more than one province. It might be the same as or distinct from the next level, the curator. Azzarello argues that this also, unlike the rank below it, frontistes, had responsibility for more than one province. It is unclear if it is really different from epitropos or is just the Greek word and the Latin word curator, and that epitropos is just the Greek rendering. Frontistes begins to appear in the imperial estates from 439 on. A frontistes was responsible for an entire province and thus stood at a level comparable to that of a dux, even if far less important. So this was the second level of management reached by Flavius Strategius I, and at this rank he acquired the title of spectabilis comes sacri consistorii. Fourth, the dioiketes, who managed the estates within one of the old nomes. Flavius Strategius I is attested as a dioiketes for the household of a princess in the Oxyrhynchite by 442 and perhaps earlier. The dioiketes could enter into contracts in the name of the domus divina and could arbitrate disputes between or involving the cultivators of the estate. Some dioikete may have had bureaucratic titles such as magistrianos agens in rebus. And finally, the pronoetes, the local functionary in charge of a unit, usually at a village level, called a prostasia. The similarity to the operation of the estates of the apiones will be obvious to anybody familiar with that. His duties were above all the collection, dispatch, and accounting for the revenues and taxes for the prostasia, along with organizing labor, taking care of machinery and supplies, and dealing with legal matters. He may even have been involved in helping draft petitions, and he may have had a secretary. Indeed, given how much of the traditional village administration he may have succeeded, it is hard to imagine him without a clerical staff. When we turn to look at the evidence for private estates in Roman Egypt, it will become evident that there is some arbitrariness in the way that a hierarchy has been constructed by the imperial households out of these titles, although the superiority of the epitropos to other ranks is pretty consistent. What might be more striking is that pronoetes, dioiketes, frontidzon, and epitropos are all words used in Greek as renderings of the Latin procurator, a point that I shall come back to. Of course, epitropos has a long history in Greek to refer to administrators, and dioiketes was used already for the Ptolemaic finance minister. But in the case of dioiketes, there seems to be no continuity of usage between that Ptolemaic official and the minor figures attested in early Roman Egypt. The situation with frontistes and pronoetes is still more curious and bears closer examination. The term frontistes is so familiar to anyone working with the papyri of Roman and Byzantine Egypt that it is initially surprising to discover that it was unknown in Ptolemaic Egypt. The word itself was, of course, not new. It is what Aristophanes calls Socrates in the clouds, and Xenophon uses it for philosophers. But as an administrative term, it is unknown before its application to Athenodorus in the archive of his papers from the last decade indeed, BC, where it appears 3 times. Nor does the title become common right away. There are no securely dated examples after Athenodorus until the second half of the 1st century AD, where we find 5 instances. It is with the 2nd century that the numbers of frontisti rise substantially, with more than 100 instances, and then even more in the 3rd century, although the Theodelphian archives of Hieronymus and related families are responsible for a large share of that total. But even allowing for the overall quantities of surviving texts, the numbers then decline, but with a long tail. Pronoetes is even later in use. It is attested in the 1st century AD for a freedman serving as epitropos and pronoetes all of the metalla of Egypt in inscriptions from the eastern desert, thus used in a public situation, as we see in Pont du Désert 51. The earliest securely dated attestation in a papyrological document is not until 179. Oxyrhynchus papyrus, in which Lampone, son of Ammonius, describes himself as the pronoetes of the oikos of the gymnasiarchs of Oxyrhynchus. More distinctly private uses follow around the end of the century. It is possible that a couple of insecurely dated texts come from earlier in the 2nd century, but we can't say. Overall, it looks as if the term begins life in a governmental context and only slowly makes its way into private usage as the 2nd century wears on. And indeed, the entire number of attestations between 100 and 250 is only 9. A number of the 3rd century instances are connected to Alexandrians, including one from the Hieronymus archive. And then there is a curious instance of a pronoetes musicone in a contract from Thraso in the Fayum. It is in the 4th century that the term comes to be more extensively used. And of course, in later times, it is the standard term for managers of village-level units in the great estates, above all of the apiones. But indeed, in the 4th century already in the Dakhla oasis. In the archive of the Tiberii Iulii Theones, which dates to the years 156 to 161, we encounter an estate structured into usiai, each of which appears to be run by a prostates. The editor also read the first 4 letters all dotted, of frontistes in one of the Theon papyri, but neither on the printed plate nor on a digital image does this seem compelling to me. I'm not going to try to work through the traces in line 4 here, but I think you can see fairly easily the fourth line does not begin with very much in the way of ink. The prostatae all reported to a man named Matreas, for whom no title is given in any of these applications for payment. He was presumably in some position over all of the family's Oxyrhynchite holdings. These were evidently run on thrifty lines, as almost all of these applications were written over washed-out text from earlier use. It should be noted that the title prostates for managers also appears in 2 texts of the archive of the descendants of Patron in the Milan collection, an archive I will come back to subsequently. The context does not tell us enough to say anything meaningful about how these figures might relate to other administrators. Before moving on, I should add that there is no obvious Latin term appropriate to private management that prostates would seem to be rendering. Perhaps its usage reflects a stage when Roman concepts were not yet quite as dominant as they were later. Etymologically related, but far more doubtful, is epistates. The term appears in one of the letters in the small archive of Aphrodisias, dated to 38 to 40 AD, referring to Aphrodisias as the addressee. The letters are all from a man named Ammonius, who was a landowner in Fayum villages. And he asks for foodstuffs from Aphrodisias while sending him money and a donkey, all by means of at least weekly messengers. Given the apparent relationship of the 2 men, it is perhaps not surprising that the editors translated epistates in Ryland's Papyrus 229 as agent, and Trismegistos calls the archive that of Aphrodisias, agent of Ammonius. That he functioned as an agent seems likely, but that epistates was his title is far less clear. Still less attractive is actually translating epistates as agent, as the editors do. The term also appears in one of the papyri of the early Roman archive of Isidorus of Psopthus, and Hansen has suggested that the man referred to, Erotas, was in fact an epistates phylaketone, as are in fact almost all bearers of the term epistates in this period. In the Athenodorus archive, the term appears with reference to 4 men, including Athenodorus himself, who is elsewhere, as I mentioned earlier, called a frontistes. There's no clear indication whether these epistatae are public or private in character. The editor offered no opinion. Hagedorn leaned slightly to private, Hansen to public, but neither expressing much confidence in their view. Without going into detail, I will say that I think a public character is more likely in the Athenodorus archive. But what Aphrodisias was, it does not seem possible to say for sure. It is best with present evidence not to claim this as a title for a private manager. Epitropoi next. 2 of the larger, though not very well documented, Oxyrhynchite estates of the 3rd century show us the beginnings of hierarchy. In the small dossier of Claudia Isidora, an Alexandrian with substantial holdings in the Oxyrhynchite, documented in the 1st quarter of the 3rd century, we find a frontistes sending a request to an epitropos, asking for permission to pay vineyard staff. In another document, probably when the difficulties with the government that led by 225 to confiscation of the estate were already beginning, 2 epitropoi and a former epitropos petitioned against Strategos' action in having his grammatos place seals on the property. Other documents mention a charistes and a pragmatotes without making it clear if the pragmatotes is private or public. Not much later, we encounter Calpurnia Heraclea, a daughter of a former member of the Alexandrian Museum. From a declaration in 245, we see that she had over 1,700 aruras of uninundated or irrigated land in the Eastern Toparchy, and in the next year, her pragmatotes declares stalks of grain in her hands. Here it is clear that the pragmatotes is private. The statement of land, however, was submitted by 2 epitropoi, a term translated by the editors as guardians. This is not plausible. There is no indication in the other documents, a year earlier, that Calpurnia Heraclea was not of age at that time. One epitropos is a former gymnasiarch and prytanis of Oxyrhynchus, while the other just identifies himself as Kaios Krematidze, suggesting that he too could have had a string of such titles. These men presumably are exemplars of a phenomenon we see elsewhere and that I shall discuss later, of local aristocrats serving as property managers for the yet wealthier absentee landlords. Although documentation tends to cluster around the titled managers I have been discussing, there were lower-ranking individuals who had managerial responsibilities, whether their titles seem to reflect that or not. An example is the shepherd named Panaithios, son of Harmusus, in the archive of Autikides and the other sons of Serapion, the archive that Schwartz in his edition called P. Serapion. Panaithios was responsible for 2 accounts. Schwartz describes him as a berger chef. There's no indication that he was not the actual writer in these accounts, which is, in the case of number 52, titled Account of Sheep of Eutychides, son of Serapion, Hermopolite, through Panaithios, son of Harmusus, shepherd, poimen. Another indication of the importance of managing animals on such estates is the role played by the epictenetes on the estate of Appianus, as documented in the Hieroninus archive. In fact, Hieroninus himself was an epictenetes before becoming a frontistes. The term is attested only once outside this archive, but it seems to have designated someone in charge of the central management of animals used for transport among the frontides, or the units, of the estate. If Hieroninus was an epictenetes, it seems that literacy was here also a requisite. It is hard to imagine keeping track of all of the comings and goings of animals among the numerous estates without being able to write. Antonius Philoxenus, Appianus' son-in-law, had an archipoimen, a hint at central management of that kind of herd animals also. I believe that such people must be regarded as managers. It is the Appianus estate that gives us our most complete picture of what a large private enterprise might require in terms of management. And in Dominic Rathbone's study of this estate, we have our most extensive analysis of any such property and its management. But it should be stressed at the outset that we know only the Arsinoite holdings of Appianus. He is likely to have had land elsewhere as well. And Rathbone has noted that the Appianus alias Demetrius, attested in Hermopolis in the 260s, might be his son. If so, it is particularly interesting to observe that this man served as an epitropos for local aristocrats. And this is precisely the pattern we find in the Arsinoite estate of Appianus. The general manager, for whom no title is ever given, was Alypius, perhaps Antonius Alypius, a local aristocrat who may himself have had an equestrian career before settling back in Arsinoe. Rathbone estimates that he had about 15 important administrators working in the central management of the Nome estates. Their precise hierarchy is not clear from the documents, but it is likely that the epitropoi were Alypius's immediate subordinates. One of these, Syros, was a former kosmetes. There was also an oikonomos and some keiristai, and one of the keiristai was himself kosmetes, a son of Syros the epitropos. One oikonomos was a former gymnasiarch. It is obvious from these cases that the core top management all came from the local elite, the holders and former holders of civic magistracies. Although there is evidence for the use of oikonomos to render the Latin villicus, it seems unlikely that this equivalence is intended here. There were also significant assistants, not all of whom are given titles. At the local level, each unit was a frontis, a cura, one may say, and was managed by a frontistes. Rathbone notes that the title pronoetes also occurs, but rarely, and it is not evident if it means anything different from frontistes. The frontistae were in charge of all local agricultural operations, the maintenance of property, staffing, and detailed monthly reports. There is no explicit sign that the frontistae had any administrative or secretarial staff, although, as we discussed last time, there's some reason in the handwriting to believe that the frontistes did not do all of the writing himself. But in general, if such employees were needed for a time, they would be sent out from the central office. And as we have seen, transport was managed centrally, as was the selling of estate products into the markets. The compensation of managers in this estate is not well understood. Rathbone thought that the higher status administrators were not paid salaries at all. I find this unlikely. All that we actually know, as he observes, is that no salaries for them were charged out to the frontides. But we have neither the central accounts for Arsinoe nor yet those maintained in Alexandria. The frontistae were paid apparently 40 drachmas plus 1 artiba of wheat per month. This is not an impressive figure, comparable in fact to what a casual laborer made. And it probably does not reflect their full compensation, let alone their entrepreneurial activities on the side, which are well attested. The frontistae did not come from the same social level as the higher administrators, but Rathbone describes them as of free birth from prosperous but not council-level families, and in some cases probably descended from veterans. In the administration of private estates, the documentation offers many opportunities to discover the managers. In public administration, the reverse is true. The titular heads of offices, whether in the honorific archae of the metropolis or the liturgical tasks, figure extensively in the documents. Those who did most of the actual work are masked, rarely named in the texts. It is thus not surprising that modern scholarly accounts of public administration can give only a small part of their attention to the supporting staff. This is not the fault of the authors of these treatments, whether it is Friedrich Ertel in his pioneering work on liturgy a century ago, or Thomas Kruse recently in his massive monograph on the Basilikos Grammatos. Scholarly diligence can discover only so much. The generic title that represents the upper level of the supporting administrative staff was hyperetes, studied in the detailed monograph of Sylvia Strassi. The best known of them, not surprisingly, is the hyperetes of the strategos, who carried out a wide range of functions. Strassi enumerates among these the registration, subscription, and publication of documents and acts, summonses to trial, management of liturgical obligations, the opening of wills, handling public doctors' reports, and so on. A strategos would need more than one of these versatile managers, and there are 2 4th century references to archi-hyperetae. There is also substantial evidence for hyperetae of other high officials, including in the 4th century the logistes, exactor, defensor, and nyktostrategos. In contrast, and perhaps somewhat bafflingly, there is little secure evidence for hyperetae in the office of the Basilikos Grammatos. This contrast might point to a less executive character in the office of that official. On the other hand, Strassi points to a long list of lower offices for which there is only a single attestation of a hyperetes: the epistates of phylaketae, the presbyteroi, komogrammatos, bankers, archephados, and systatai. Higher offices, those of the prefect and procurators, certainly had hyperetae, and so did the municipal archi of prytanes and exegetes, along with the councils themselves. So the missing hyperetae of the Basilikos Grammatos may just be a quirk of the documentation. Not much can be known about the background of the hyperetae, according to Strassi, although she points out that in the period before the Antonine Constitution, they overwhelmingly have Greek names. Ertel viewed the hyperetae as the officials who represented their employers in dealings outside the office. They were the outside men, in contrast to most of the rest of the staff, who were part of the internal workings of the office. He noted as well that various types of security personnel dealt with the outside world, but they do not come into our discussion here. As for the inside men of the public administration, they largely bear generic titles, such as charistes, boethos, and grammatos. There is little evidence for their organization, although Kruse points to the existence of the title of hegumenos in some offices of the Basilikos Grammatos and strategos, suggesting that the higher offices had what we would call a chief of staff. Not a lot is known about the recruitment of these staff. There was no professional human resources or personnel department, fortunately perhaps, and staff were apparently identified and chosen by the appointed officials for whom they worked. There is some evidence that the officials required surety contracts for performance by their subordinates, but we do not know how widespread this practice was. Nor do we know to what extent office personnel changed when the officials did. Given the personal nature of the engagements, in the case of official positions with no fixed term, such as the strategos and Basilikos Grammatos, employment may well have ended officially with the term of the employer. but reappointment by the new office holder was possible and probably desirable. Kruse notes that a single man was grammateus of the bibliophilakes of public accounts in the Arsinoite nome for 27 years, which must have been through the terms of at least 5 pairs of bibliophilakes. It is not possible to say with any confidence how many of these people could properly be regarded as managers. As I noted earlier, the term grammateus is particularly elusive. Today, inflation in titles has devalued the English term secretary and its cognates in other languages. But even in my younger years, the secretary was often the person who really ran the organization. I look here at Gilles Bronsbourg, who is an executive director, and a couple of predecessors back, the chief executive of his society was the secretary. And there are many other such examples. Most of these have now become executive directors or chief executive officers or something even grander. But perhaps appropriately in our own Association Internationale de Papyrologues, it remains the secretary who is the chief executive. And such vestiges of older usage survive in a number of other places too. The title grammateus in the office of the strategos might conceal a powerful person. Kruse thinks that the grammateus were higher in status than the boethoi, but the nature of the boethoi is even more nebulous. Not much is known about the recruitment or compensation of either group. The catalog that I have presented so far, however long and tedious it may have been, is only part of the picture. There are many cases in which we are certainly dealing with managers, but either they are completely concealed behind the documents for which they are responsible, or we have a name, but no title. I shall discuss some of these cases in the final lecture, but for the moment I offer one exemplary situation. In the archive of Eutychides, the son of Serapion. There we encounter several men who should be classified as managers. Demetrius, son of Herodes, is the writer of the body of at least 6 agreements in this archive. A sale of animals, 3 loans of money, an advance of money, and a lease of land. Hermaios, alias Phoebion, son of Ammonius, writes an offer to buy animals and a loan of money. Heraion, son of Hermias, writes an advance of money and a lease of land. This writing activity led Schwartz to call them scribes. Scribe is, in many cases, as I said in an earlier lecture, a lazy term. What does it mean? What are these men doing? In these documents, they are nominally writing on behalf of the other parties entering into agreements with their employer Eutychides or another member of his family. That is, they theoretically write for the borrowers, the lessees, and the purchasers. But in reality, they're working for Eutychides. In the case of P. Serapion 12, the purchaser was in fact capable of writing, but it was Hermaios alias Phoebion who wrote for him. Are we to suppose that the parties for whom these men wrote dictated the contracts? This seems most unlikely. Contract writing was a professional skill, but these men are not contract writers sitting on a street corner in a Hermopolite village waiting for customers. They are people who work for Eutychides. They know what should go into a contract, and they know what their employer will agree to and subscribe. Even when an individual writer's identity is not visible, as in this document from the Serapion archive, an offer of lease, we can see that the writer has a great deal of information about the land to be leased and how the lessor happened to have possession of it. Who had that information? The lessor or his business agent, obviously. In fact, we have a letter addressed by Serapion to Hermaios alias Phoebion, in which he is addressed as son, and sent money for brick making. One doesn't send money to a scribe for brick making. These men are clearly managers. They have no titles in any documents, and the archive is in fact singularly lacking in all of the titles that I have surveyed. This does not mean they did not have titles. It probably only means that the nature of the archive is such that no texts with titles survive. It is not the manager's archive. It is the landlord's, and the estate is not large enough to produce the hierarchy that we see in the later and larger properties. In this respect, I need only point to the long confusion over the identity of laches. Once the eponym of the archive, now described as that of the descendants of Patron, which will be discussed in the final lecture. The use of familial terminology rather than the more bureaucratic titles makes it hard to see what the title may have been. But it should not lead us to miss the fact that these men were managers. Now, it is possible that at this point some of you are thinking, so what? Where does all of this get us? I shall explore 6 points that seem to me of significance. First, it is striking to a modern eye how little differentiation and specification there is. Many of the terms we find are very general, meaning manager or person responsible for, without any indication of what. And where there is, it is likely to be a place rather than a function. There is not much of the modern propensity to title people assistant director for personnel or the like. Nor do the titles have any inherent hierarchy built into them. Frontistes and pronoetes may be interchangeable, or one may be a level or two above the other. There is nothing to tell you. It is not as if the ancients could not give such specific titles when they found it useful. Land surveyors and grain measurers have specific titles, for example, and so do bankers and engineers. But generally speaking, managers do not. Second, we can observe that most of the terms used were either unknown or rare in the Ptolemaic period. As we have seen, frontistes and pronoetes have no Ptolemaic background at all. Dioiketes is a term of public administration and used entirely differently than in either the early Roman Empire or later. Similarly, oikonomos was an important office in public administration. Charistes is a relatively uncommon term for assistants to certain public officials in the Ptolemaic administration, never a term in private management in that period. Epitropos was unknown. Boethos never appears as a designation for an assistant to either a public or a private administrator under the Ptolemies, although the word is perfectly well attested in more general meanings of helper. This is all certainly not because the Greek-speaking population of Ptolemaic Egypt did not have management, but they evidently did not have the same need as their successors under the Romans did for an extended vocabulary in the private sphere. Third, what we find does, in fact, seem to be very Roman. The listed commonest terms are all listed as equivalents for procurator in Hugh Mason's Greek terms for Roman institutions, a flawed but nonetheless useful work. He cites examples for all of them. Charistes, just like pronoetes, epitropos, dioiketes, and frontistes, is glossed as procurator. For oikonomos, Mason cites actor, dispensator, and villicus. For boethos, he gives auditor, or the equivalent. Well, of course there were Latin equivalents for these Greek terms, you might say. But the overwhelming prevalence of procurator as the equivalent coupled with the failure of these terms to appear until the Roman period, seems to me important. The scholarship of recent decades, I'm thinking particularly of the work of Eleanor Dickey and Hélène Couvigny, has shown that many things that look like perfectly good Greek in the papyri turn out to be innovations of the Roman period, and indeed to be calques of Latin words and expressions. I suggest that the same is true of most of the vocabulary of management. Fourth, I detect some appropriation of official bureaucratic language into the private sphere. Dioiketes, oikonomos, and kairistes all belong to this group. Certainly what survives of Ptolemaic jargon is used in a wider fashion than before. Perhaps we see here a reflection of the way in which the Romans gradually replaced the professionalized administration of the Ptolemies with their own characteristically more amateurish mode, rotating wealthy civilians through the positions of honor or compulsion and privatizing the relationship between magistrates and liturgists on the one hand and their staff on the other. Fifth, we begin to get some sense of how the educational process that I discussed last week played into the social and economic nature of the managerial population. I shall say more about this next time, but it is clear that a very high degree of what managers were called on to do involved writing. There were people who exercised some kinds of managerial functions without writing, of course, but they are mostly invisible to us. The identifiable managers all appear to use writing constantly in the course of their work. The higher ones had secretaries to whom they could dictate, but they probably did a fair amount of the work themselves all the same. We shall return to this point. For the moment, it is enough to say that the managers we have been able to identify come from milieu sufficiently well off to have received not only an elementary education, but enough training beyond that to have been able to write fluently and handle a significant volume of written traffic. They were also numerate, although hardly flawless in their arithmetic, and some could do more. As far as I can see, most of these individuals were of free birth rather than slaves, who would have been trained to a high standard at their owner's expense. There have been claims made to the contrary for some managers, and we shall need to examine these, particularly in light of the important role that slave managers undeniably played in the management of estates in Roman Italy and perhaps elsewhere. And so this is my sixth point. One estate where a significant presence of slaves has been alleged is that of Epimachus, located in the Hermopolite nome. The account that documents it is more famous than most because of the fact that it has Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, along with some commentary on Demosthenes in Medium on the verso, and some scholia on Callimachus Aetia on the recto. It was republished with a detailed commentary by Anna Schwiderek and has been discussed also by Dennis Kehoe, as well as in Christelle Fro's book now. Didymus, the chief manager, was free, as we can see from the fact that he has a patronymic, Aspasios, a rare name found in the Roman period in 3 Hermopolite papyri of the following generation. Schwiderek and Kehoe believed that the workers were largely free, although they disagreed on how many were permanent employees versus casual hirelings. The arguments for slave status are not strong, although they have received some attention. In part, the argument rests on the fact that many of the workers are not given patronymics in the account. But there is no need for patronymics, unless the men need to be distinguished from homonyms. And their names do not, in general, strike me as slave names. The absence of pay in this account is also not probative. We do not know whose pay Didymus was responsible for handling and who was paid by the owner. A thornier problem is posed by Epagathos, the steward of Lucius Belenus Gemellus. He was in charge of states in 5 locations, of which the most important was Euhemeria. The published part of this archive consists mainly of letters from Gemellus and other members of the family to Epagathos. Gemellus consistently addresses Epagathos as to idio. Hélène Couvigny has shown that where this term is applied directly to a personal name in this fashion, it suggests both that the individual is the agent of the writer, in whom he has confidence, and that he is subordinate in status. This is again a new idiom in the Roman period. She describes this usage as un véritable nom de fonction. She does not claim that it was a status term, i.e., that it marked slavery, although she cites the case of Epagathos as evidence that someone called idios, Latin suus, could be a slave. Indeed, she points to another case in which the recipient of such a letter is an Aurelius, and thus clearly a free citizen. One might also add that in BGU 37, the recipient is described as a lesones, a temple position that would not have been held by a slave. And the reference to an adelphos, presumably meaning colleague, of the recipient in Zammelbooks 12322 suggests the kind of relationship with free colleagues that we find in many other texts. On the other hand, in P. Bod 35, the person referred to either has been manumitted or anticipates manumission. So I think we can accept Couvigny's implied conclusion that this idiom refers to the dependent business relationship of writer to sender and not to the latter's juridical status. It denotes a relationship and not a status. As for Epagathos, the assertion that he was a slave rests on the evidence of P.F. 260, as published by Vesely. There we have a loan made by Lucius Belenus Gemellus, dia epagathu paidariou, through Epagathos his paidarion. No age is given for him, but as this text dates to 109-110, and we have an age for him of 35 given in another papyrus dated between 98 and 102, he must have been around 45 in the later document. Although there has been some controversy over the years, it has generally been accepted that paidarion means slave. The term does not, it should be noted, appear in P. Oxford 10, the earlier of the papyri, in which he is Gemellus's intermediary. This is P.F. 260. I shall not argue that people designated as paidaria are never slaves, but I have to raise doubts about the idea that the term necessarily refers to a slave. That is, that it is a status term. Giuseppina Azzarello has in fact expressed doubt that Epagathos was a semplice schiavo because he represents Gemellus in contracts. I do not know what the difference between a simple slave and any other slave is, but there is to my mind a more substantial argument, which is that male slaves in Roman Egypt were almost always manumitted, long before the age of 45. This point first clearly appeared from the study of the census declarations, in which no male slave over the age of 32 appears, and in fact only one that old, only one over the age of 30, while female slaves continue to appear with ages through their 40s. It is true that there are 2 securely read cases of sales of male slaves older than 32 in Jean Strauss's monograph on slave sales, although with the suspiciously round ages of 40 and 50. The possible age 51 in Strauss's table is certainly incorrect. In a forthcoming re-edition of this text, I show that the age is actually 30. Now, it is not impossible that Agathos was an outlier, still not manumitted at age 45, but the odds do not favor it. And the absence of any mention of his supposed status in P. Oxford 10 also does not support the idea that even then he was a slave. Is it possible then that paidarion is, like idios, a designation of a function and or a relationship rather than a legal status? Paidaria appear in a wide variety of contexts. There were paidaria of the basilikos grammatos, of the strategos, of the komogrammatos. They often appear as a group in estate accounts. In general, these texts do not inform us very fully about the legal status of paidaria, and what evidence there is does not direct us toward a single answer, despite many assertions to the contrary, and most recently a vigorous argument to this effect by Kyle Harper. In PSI 1254, an 8-year-old paidarion named Zoilos is reported sold for a price, and thus is surely a slave. Indeed, the request for anacresis uses the term doulos for him. On the other hand, Rathbone pointed to the case of the paidarion Sarapamon, a carpenter on the Appianus estate, who had 2 sons who became free contract laborers on the estate. Slaves could not have legally recognized sons. Much later, we find paidaria with patronymics. Even more striking is the remark that I put up on the screen here from BGU 1079, where Serapion writes, Lega auto, allo ego, allo pantes, ego paidarin emi, paratalenton soi peprakata fortia mu, ugoide time ho patron poise. Tell him, it's one thing for me, another for everybody else. I'm a paidarion. I sold my merchandise to you for a talent too little. I do not know what my patron will do to me. Freedmen have patrons. Slaves have owners. And lest you be inclined to argue that this is just figurative language, John Ray, in a careful examination of the evidence for patron, showed that in the early centuries, and this letter dates only to AD 41, the term patron is always used in a technically correct fashion, only later becoming metaphorical. More broadly, paidaria in a number of accounts occur along with occupational groups. There's not time to examine these in detail today, but they suggest to me that Rathbone's suggestion that paidaria were a class of dependent workers comparable to but lower than boethoi may have been on the right track. If so, paidarion would, like idios, refer to an undifferentiated dependent status, which might include both slaves and freedmen, and perhaps even freeborn. In this respect, it is worth recalling Rathbone's observation that there is only one mention of an apoleutheros in the entire Hieronymus dossier, in a formal contract where such precision would be relevant. And freedmen in general, I think, are not mentioned as often in papyri as one might expect, given how early male slaves were normally manumitted. Could a habit of lumping slaves and freedmen together in some contexts be responsible for this scarcity of freedmen? Was Epagathus perhaps a freedman already by the time we meet him at age 35? It is time now to turn to look a bit less superficially at some specific managers and estates, and that is what I propose to do in the final lecture next week. Thank you.